are within a larger National Register district. That district was initially formed in 1980 with just Bank Street. 1985 is when they added Old Decatur in. Being on the National Register does not do any sort of design review. It doesn't put the property owners under any sort of a restriction. The National Register is essentially a list for the federal government sort of stating, hey, these are very special places. You, the federal government, need to be very careful anything you do that could impact these. So anything funded by the federal government, pass-through funds from the state, a lot of times road work is sort of a major one that could impact buildings. If you have National Register listed buildings or sites within that area, they get special consideration because they're on the National Register. And if you're sort of sitting there scratching your head going, well, wait a minute, we have like, if we want to change a doorknob on the outside of our building, we have this HPC thing. That's a local overlay. So you literally have two different regulatory structures. The local overlay is when the citizens of Decatur said they wanted a zoning just for the residential portions only, and that was brought in at a later date. That was about 1990. So tonight we're focusing on the National Register District. That's what this project focuses on. And it was first put together in 1980, updated in 85. In theory, you're supposed to resurvey your areas about every 10 years. That's theory. In practice, it normally happens every 15 to 20. But ours hasn't been updated since like 1985, and that's the year they brought out the Sony Walkman. So it's time to look at it again. We have entire blocks that now are missing buildings. Districts can expand and contract. And when they look at significance, they look for buildings that normally are 50 years old or older. Well, a 50-year-old building in 1980 is a different date than a 50-year-old building now. So everything built post-World War II up until 1971 has the ability to be contributing. So we have some wonderful buildings like on Bank Street, the Tower Building, which looks like something out of Mad Men. That was not eligible when the district was surveyed. It wasn't old enough. It's old enough now. It's more than old enough now. So, and these things are all eligible for tax credits, but the paperwork has to be updated, and our paperwork hasn't been updated, so we need to sort of update it. So the city received grant money, matching grant money from the federal government that went through the state of Alabama, and with that, we sent out an RFP looking for a consultant who could do this survey work. And the consultant that was selected was Painter Preservation. The principal is working on this project, and I'm going to let her take over. This is Diana Painter. She is going to be very modest about this, but she's probably one of the best specialists in modern architecture that I've worked with, and so I've worked with her professionally before. Was really pleased to have her on this project because there's a lot of focus on the post-World War II buildings, because we have such beautifully preserved Victorian and Craftsman buildings, but we have a whole several decades worth of buildings with no data on yet. So I'm going to make Diana go dig up all that great data. And we will save questions to the end. And if you're out there listening and you have questions, my email is up on the screen at some point. Lamar, you had it up, and you can email me, and I will read them over.
Okay, I'll take my mask. Thank you, Carolyn. As Carolyn said, I'm Diana Painter of Painter Preservation. I've been in business for just almost 19 years. My firm was established 19 years ago, and I've done a whole variety of projects in numerous states. This is my first venture eastwards. I usually work on the West Coast. But I specialize in modern architecture, but also a lot of other things. I love Italianate. I live in a craftsman house. So the project that Carolyn introduced is the resurvey of Bank Street, Old Decatur National Register District. And as she mentioned, it's made up of two components. We'll talk about them in a minute. But the overall project goals are to resurvey and photograph the buildings in the district. We don't have a good record of that because of the age of the nominations that were done previously. And then we will determine whether they retain their integrity, which really means architectural character. So if they were contributing to the district, are they still contributing? That's one question we'll answer through this survey. We'll determine, whether they still contribute to a district, and we'll also be looking at the boundary again. So because we're expanding what they call period significance through the modern era, through possibly 1975, That might bring in more buildings. A change in architectural character might shrink the district. The fact that we're missing a number of buildings in the Bank Street, we'll look at that and see what we think that means for the future for that area. And then another component of the project is to conduct research on the post-World War II era in the district and beyond. And that will involve developing a historic context, which is more or less a historic narrative that covers that period from, well, we're going to look at 1940 to about 1975. And again, that will influence whether the district grows or shrinks or stays the same. It might just stay the same. So we'll see. That's part of the whole process. And then at the end, we, of course, develop a survey report and summarize all the findings. And in the meantime, the city will have a whole new set of survey documents to use. As Carolyn mentioned, the National Register districts came about in two different times. The Bank Street district was nominated or accepted in 1980, and the Old Decatur in 1985. And just to back up just a little bit, for people who aren't familiar, or even if people just want, need a reminder, what is the National Register and what does it do? On the National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places we consider worthy of preservation. And to be listed in the National Register, which you can be listed, a building or a structure, can be listed individually or as part of a district. And in general, they must be significant in the areas of American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. And culture, of course, is a very broad category. And usually over 50 years of age. Some of the Cold War, this example of resources that are significant under 50 years of age are resources that are associated with the Cold War or in the past associated with the Cold War because time marches on and so over 50 years of age now. And then they also have to retain integrity. And integrity is this kind of the equivalent of architectural character, which I mentioned before. It's actually a function of, let's see, I usually can do this right off the top. We'll see. Location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So it's not an open-ended type of definition. It's actually all those criteria are applied and evaluated to, and the resources evaluated according to those criteria. And so what are the advantages of being listed in the National Register? In general, some people are interested in it just for the recognition. And for a community, it can help in the promotion of heritage. Heritage travel is a market for it. It can make a property eligible for state and federal tax incentives. And it can increase the eligibility of a property for grants. It can allow a building code leniency under certain circumstances. So buildings that don't meet current codes can sometimes get additional leeway just from being listed in a register, the National Register. And then consideration in planning for federal projects, which Carolyn talked about a little bit. And Alabama has a tax incentive program, not all states do. And then, of course, federal tax incentives are available across the country for income-producing properties, so not single-family residential. So, as Carolyn mentioned again, listing in the Bank Street Historic District adds no additional review process for owners of those buildings, but listing in the Old Decatur Historic District does require local review by the HPC for changes to the buildings, and that's under the auspices of a local overlay. So just a little bit about the districts. Bank Street, the first district. I have a sketch that went along with the nomination that you can see above. And 1980s era. It doesn't look like the graphics we do today. Bank Street Historic District it encompasses about 40 buildings and 6 blocks. The buildings were constructed from the 1870s to the mid-20th century. They're mostly 1 and 2 story commercial buildings, almost exclusively. The tower building is an exception to that. There's a couple other exceptions. And the reason it developed in the first place is that the area was a juncture of rail, wagon, and barge transportation. And you can imagine when they started constructing the buildings that are extant there now in the 1870s, that those would be really state-of-the-art transportation. And then the Bank Street, or the old Decatur National Register districts, mainly residential. If you add Bank Street and Old Decatur together, it's approximately 340 buildings, about 117 acres. The houses were built from the 1870s to the 1940s, for the most part. And it's significant under Criterion A for its association with events, and under Criterion C for its architecture. And there's a number of important people associated with the district, and trends in community development and government development, or government expansion. Now, the other part of the project, developing a national a historic context statement, will draw on certain themes, and others might be suggested by the research. Again, the context will cover the years from about 1940 or the beginning of World War II to 1975, which is about 50 years ago. And some of the themes that will likely be addressed is industrial growth in that time frame, and government expansion, commercial expansion, residential expansion, and annexation. It was a time when Decatur was annexing neighborhoods. Trends and themes of segregation, white flight, civil rights, and urban renewal. And urban renewal was a big deal in Decatur. We are in an urban renewal building. So the Civic Center campus came about as part of urban renewal. And the next slide just is a little illustration of that, the conceptual drawings being regarded here by the architects, and the building that we're in today. And then the way we're going to get to the reevaluation of the district, the old Bank Street and Old Decatur Historic District, is through the survey process. And these are copies of illustrations of State of Alabama's survey forms, and on the left is just some data about the buildings. On the right are photographs, and we try to get representative 2 or 3 photographs. And then also part of this is the architectural description of the exterior only, and changes that can be observed to have happened, and then a little description of the setting overall. So you can tell from looking at this that it's not very detailed. It doesn't go into a big history of the buildings. It doesn't even go into a little history of the buildings for the most part, although if people want to offer some history of the buildings that they own or work in, that's always welcome. But it's pretty brief. It's called a reconnaissance level survey. And the history comes in the overarching historical context statement. We're going to emphasize the modern era in this statement, but the existing nominations have historic background already in them from the earlier eras. So just so you can see the level of detail, it's not really terribly detailed, but it gives you enough information to make the decisions that you need to make about the district and its future. And the next is just a list of some of the information, all the locational information that's associated with the building or structure, the construction date and alterations date as they're known. Sometimes those are estimates. The architect or builder, if you have one, the building form, which is the description of the building form, and the architectural style or the building type, and its use historically and currently. And like I said, some of these are to the extent known, but I think we'll be able to discern pretty good information on that from the information we have on hand, and then from the actual built environment itself. The building materials, and that's why you do this in person and not just on Google Earth and Street View. because materials really can't have to be seen close up to discern what they are in a lot of cases. And character defining features, and those can be the configuration of the windows, certain special features, like the building that's pictured here has these multi-light ribbon windows. Those are a characteristic of the time or the style in which this building was constructed. The railings along the roof deck there are special features of that style. So those are the kinds of things that we'll call out as character defining features. And character defining features are things that you want to retain when your building is undergoing any changes. Retaining those features will help ensure that the building retains integrity or its architectural character. And then the overall setting is included as part of the description. So that's what I have tonight, and I'll be glad to answer any questions. I've been out there for about a day and a half surveying, if anyone's seen me out there walking around.
So will you be surveying each home in Old Decatur? You go from house to house?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you include the outbuildings too. I mean, they're just listed, single garage with a gable roof, that kind of thing.
Sherry and I live in the Todd House, which was built in 1836. So, do you suspect that with the architectural changes in the neighborhood, that our neighborhood may expand, or is it going to contract? Do y'all have a feel for that yet?
It's too soon to know because we don't have the data. We have to have meetings with the state and we sit down and look at maps. Typically, though, when you have a district that has sat and hasn't been reviewed in this long of a period, you will get both. So areas on Bank Street where there's been massive demolition and there's nothing there now, it will depend on what the state and the feds are looking for, but I do expect there to be a conversation about, you don't want to have large vacant tracts of land. I mean, you're putting very special protections from what the federal government can and can't do on this, and if it's vacant land, there's nothing to protect. And at the same time, we're going to have a lot of buildings potentially come in that were built post-World War II that were not eligible because they weren't historic at the time the district was surveyed, but they might be now. So that could shift boundaries in another direction. And that's pretty typical. Diana, you've done more of these than I have in recent years, but
A commercial district can undergo changes, especially if a city itself has undergone changes, like urban renewal is a big deal, although urban renewal properties like this one are now eligible because of their age. But just being out there walking around all day today, and my observation just off the top is the residential portion of the district's pretty stable and established. That was, and I think that's pretty typical too, really, most of the time.
especially if there's local overview.
Yeah,
If you have local design review, that will normally hold the integrity. Whereas I went into a municipality in Alabama a few years ago and did a survey for them, and they had no local design review, and I got to explain to them they were probably going to lose half their district because in the 40 years that it had been sitting there, they'd had so many demolitions, so many remodels, that there was very little historic fabric left because they didn't have local design review. So the local design review actually really helps buffer the district even at the federal level eventually.
And there's different kinds of design review too. Some cities have included demolition delay or demolition protections with their overlay zones, but a lot don't. And then some areas that I've worked on since I live on the West Coast are undergoing tremendous development pressure. So just because changes in population, job growth, all that kind of thing, and they're not protected. So that can happen too. But my neighborhood and my house is all pretty much 1920s and very stable. It's like, think about it, actually varies a lot. But there's no protections in my neighborhood either. It's desirable. People buy in. They take care of their homes. But my observations today that there seemed to be a lot of stability in the neighborhood.
And when you see Diana, she might be more aware of her surroundings than I am when I survey, but literally, you know, you walk because you've got to have your camera. So I'll stand in the middle of the street a lot if I think I can get away with it because I can get a better view. But it's, you know, picture the front of the house, picture of each sort of side angle, then you write a few notes on your clipboard, which is, are the windows original? Are they replacement? If they're replacement, are they vinyl? Are they metal? Does it look like that awning might be new? Maybe there's an outbuilding. Does that look like it's original or is it, you know, vintage? But it's just a couple minutes with each building, but it adds up because you go down and surveyors have different patterns. I like to follow the sun, so I'll do maybe only one side of the street based on the sun and then come back a different hour to hit the other side. If it's cloudy, we love cloudy days, no rain but clouds, and you can do both sides of the street and not have shadows lines in your photos. One of these days I'm gonna get hit by a car if I'm not careful. It's an occupational hazard. And if it rains, sometimes, you know, if we've already done the photos, we'll come back and when it's raining and just sit in front of each house for a few minutes, like, okay, I'm pretty sure, yeah, this is vinyl. Okay, I'll sit in my car and make that note because I don't want to be walking and trying to take notes with an umbrella. So I normally the police get called a lot. There's this person walking up and down the street with a camera, you know, and sometimes they think I'm the tax assessor. I get that one a lot. People think I'm the tax assessor. I'm like, no, I'm not the tax assessor. So you may have already seen her out, and if you haven't, you might see her at some point in the next month. She'll be here for a few more days, and then she'll come back later next month to do some more survey work. Any other questions? So what happens with all this when it's done, we will have all these survey forms. We will have an Excel chart that lists what they consider contributing and non-contributing. We sit down with the state. They will review all of the paperwork. There will be a discussion about, wow, you know, what we're hoping for is wow, you have some really great post-World War II buildings. They're not within this district. Let's update that. Let's update the paperwork to bring that portion online, and that makes them available for tax credits. So say the Tower building on Bank Street, one of the very first things I did when I got in here was work very hard to get them federal money for a rehabilitation historic tax credit. Combined with the state, it's 45 cents on the dollar. That's a big part of their project. Well, my very first phone call to the state was they're not eligible for this because the Tower building is not considered a contributing building within the district because our paperwork hasn't been updated since 1980. So my conversation with the state is how fast can we update this paperwork because it's worth $2 million to that project. That's a huge, I mean, that project is make or break based on that ability. So, and the state's like, well, it takes a couple years because you've got to resurvey. You know, you can't just do one building. You have to do the whole neighborhood because it's a package. It's a package deal. So those of you that live in the Albany district that are listening, Albany was updated more recently, maybe 2010. It's been a while since I've looked at the paperwork. We also have a National Register district, two of them in Old Town East and Old Town West. They were done around 2004, 2005, I think. So those are obviously, they're a little dated now, but not as dated as 1985. And Decatur has the potential for other historic districts. There's some really wonderful post-World War II neighborhoods in the city if people, you know, we're gonna start looking at some of those just to see, because the tax credits are really helpful for commercial projects. You can occasionally qualify for residential. It's a slightly different process, but commercial is fairly easy to qualify. And so even if you are renting, if you are a landlord and you are renting houses, if you follow these special design review guidelines to keep the building looking historic, you're eligible for up to 45 cents on the dollar. So it makes a difference very quickly. Any questions from anyone who's dialed in? I know there are a couple of you who've dialed in. I'm checking my email to see if I've received any. I don't have any emailed ones. That's it?
One question. There are apartments behind the Carnegie at the corner of Lafayette and Oak.
Okay.
Were those in the original historic district back in survey in 85, or are they following the purview of the new evaluation?
Everything shown in here in this large pink box here, this is all the original district boundary. So everything in there is within the district. what the question is, are they contributing or non-contributing, and that impacts their tax credit status. So the district, if you have a boundary, everything in it is in the district. The question is, what's the category it fits in? And either it's contributing, which means it's eligible for tax credits, or it's non-contributing, which means it's not. Non-contributing, they can either be too young. We have a lot that are just too young, or they were too young at the time the district was formed. They can be buildings that have had significant alterations that no longer honor the history of the building, or you can have vacant lots. And we have some of those too. Those are sort of the three major ways you get a non-contributing. So what we're doing is we're like, okay, we probably have some new vacant lots, and we have some vacant lots that were vacant in 1980, 85 that now have buildings on them. Those buildings aren't old enough to be eligible yet, but we need to mark that these lots have changed. We have some buildings that have been changed, perhaps not in the most sympathetic manner. They may lose their status as contributing based on the review. And then we have some buildings that, again, like 1940s, 1950s buildings that would have been an absolute no in 1980, that now we're like, oh, that's a really cool modern building, or that's a really interesting neo-formalist building, and we need to talk about putting this in the status. So the apartments, I don't know their status. I'd have to pull the original nomination to look at it, but they were within the district originally, yes. So the only district boundary change was the original district was Bank Street only in 1980. In 1985, they added all of the residential portion of Old Decatur, and they merged them into one district. All right, any other questions? Well, we will have another public meeting when all this is concluded. So when Diana has her survey findings, we've met with the state, they've reviewed the paperwork. It will probably be very late summer, early fall, depending on how long it takes for them to process the material. And we will make sure we let everyone know again. If you have any questions, afterwards you can come up, you can talk to Diana, you can talk to me, or you can also email me, and I will answer them as best I can. Thank you, everyone, for coming.